Ever imagined a world where drinking beer all day, every day, wasn't just for fun, but for survival? Welcome to the Middle Ages, where a pint of ale was often a much safer bet than a glass of water. It sounds crazy, right? But stick with me, and you'll discover the rather disgusting truth about medieval hydration. So, let's talk about water. Forget the crystal clear, filtered stuff we have on tap today. In medieval times, sources of clean water were incredibly scarce. Rivers and streams were the town's all-in-one sewer, garbage disposal, and laundry basin. Think about it. Animal waste, human waste, leftovers from tanneries and butcher shops, it all ended up in the local water supply. Wells weren't much better. They could easily be contaminated by cesspits seeping into the groundwater. Drinking this water was like playing a game of Russian roulette with your health. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were rampant, and a simple sip of water could lead to a swift and unpleasant end. People knew that drinking from certain sources made them sick, even if they didn't understand the science of germs and bacteria. They just knew that water was risky. So, what was the alternative? Ale. Lots and lots of ale. It was the go-to drink for everyone, from peasants to nobles, and even for children. But why was it safer? The magic lies in the brewing process. First, you start by boiling water. This step alone was a lifesaver, as the high temperatures killed off most of the harmful pathogens lurking in the contaminated water. No one in the Middle Ages knew about pasteurization, but they were effectively doing it every time they brewed a batch of ale. Next, you add malted barley to the boiled water, creating a sugary liquid called wort. Then comes the fermentation. Yeast is added to the wort, and this is where the second layer of protection comes in. The yeast consumes the sugars and produces alcohol. Now, the ale they drank wasn't like the strong craft beers we have today. It was often a small beer or small ale, with a very low alcohol content, maybe just 1 to 2%. It wasn't enough to get you stumbling around the village, but it was enough to inhibit the growth of any surviving bacteria. The combination of boiling and alcohol made ale a significantly safer, more hygienic choice than the local water. It was the medieval equivalent of bottled water. Because ale was so vital to daily life, ensuring its quality was a serious business. This is where one of the coolest medieval jobs comes in, the ale conner or ale taster. This wasn't just some guy who got to drink on the job. The ale taster was an official appointed by the town or manor to check the quality of every batch of ale brewed for sale. Their methods, however, were a bit unconventional. One of the most famous and bizarre techniques involved a pair of leather breeches. The ale taster would pour a bit of the ale onto a wooden bench and then sit down in it, wearing his leather pants. He would then sit there for a while, letting the puddle dry. The test was simple. If he stood up and his pants stuck to the bench, the ale was good. Why? Because it meant the brewer hadn't watered it down and had used enough sugar and malt in the brewing process. The residual sugar in the ale would make the bench sticky. If he stood up easily, it meant the ale was weak and of poor quality, and the brewer could be fined, publicly shamed in the stocks, or even have their entire batch of bad ale poured out into the street. It was a sticky situation, but it was one way to keep brewers honest. While ale was safer, let's not romanticize it too much. It wasn't always a delicious, refreshing beverage. Brewing was often done at home or in small, local alehouses, and sanitation standards were, well, non-existent. You see, the brewing process itself was a magnet for all sorts of unwanted extras. Let's start with the ingredients. The grain used for malting could be moldy or infested with weevils. During the mashing process, where grain and water are mixed, it wasn't uncommon for insects, mice, or other small creatures to fall into the vat, and they probably weren't fished out. They just became part of the brew, adding a little extra protein. Remember, this was all happening in open vats, often in rustic buildings with thatched roofs. So dust, dirt, cobwebs, and whatever else was floating in the air or falling from the ceiling would end up in your drink. And then there's the yeast. Today we use carefully cultivated strains of brewer's yeast. Back then, they relied on wild yeast floating in the air or would scoop the foamy residue from a previous batch to start the next one. A modern brewer would probably throw it out, but in the Middle Ages, it was just part of the flavor profile. For a long time, brewers didn't even use hops. Hops act as a natural preservative and add that bitter flavor we associate with beer today. Before hops became common in England around the 15th century, brewers would add all sorts of other things to flavor their ale, a mixture called grute. This could include herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, and heather, but it could also include less savory additions. Some unscrupulous brewers were known to add things to mask the taste of spoiled ale, or even to give it an extra kick. We're talking about things that are downright dangerous, like chalk to alter the color, or even hallucinogenic or poisonous plants. The line between a beverage and a bizarre concoction was often very thin. So, while the boiling and the alcohol did kill off the deadliest waterborne diseases, you were still potentially drinking a soup of dead insects, rodent droppings, mold, dirt, and wild bacteria. It puts a whole new perspective on the phrase bottoms up, doesn't it? Despite all this, ale was a cornerstone of the medieval diet. It wasn't just a drink, it was food. Ale was packed with carbohydrates and B vitamins from the grain and yeast, making it a valuable source of calories for a population that worked hard, physically demanding jobs. It was liquid bread, and it fueled the construction of castles and cathedrals. So, next time you enjoy a cold, clean, modern beer, take a moment to appreciate it. You don't have to worry about dysentery from the water, and you can be pretty sure there are no boiled mice in it. The medieval drinker wasn't so lucky. They had to choose between water that could kill them quickly and an ale that, while safer, was often a mystery brew of questionable and sometimes disgusting ingredients. It was a tough world, and your daily drink was no exception. It really makes you grateful for modern sanitation and brewing standards. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into the murky world of medieval ale fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to see next. Until then, cheers.